Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's Keep Up with Pryme. My name is Laura Andradas. I'm marketing lead at Pryme Global, and together with Aske Holz, product manager at Pryme Global, we will show you some of our new features, and we will also take a deep dive into mileage multiple rates. So let's start with advanced projects. Although there have been many application enhancements in this last release, we'll focus on two. On the one hand, we see many new features at the work in progress calculation level, where now users may designate a percent complete value based on the quantity, cost, amount, or milestone for fixed price projects. On the other hand, the integration with Dynamics 365 Sales and Business Central CRM makes it possible to create a project in advanced projects from an opportunity when this is designated as one. Moving forward to the Pryme apps, let's begin with Pryme Matters, our practice management software for law firms, accounting firms, and CPAs. In this case, new columns have been added to the resource hours Factbox, displaying the total hours and amount selected for invoicing for each resource in the matter. Our next stop takes us to Pryme Time, our time tracking application. The time entry indicators in the calendar now reflect the status following a color code, and a new report with detailed insights into time entry patterns has been created. This is a powerful tool to optimize resource management. I recommend you to have a look at our white paper on time entry patterns, where we analyze the time registration data of a 250 employee professional services company. This is to be found under resources at prymeglobal.com. And last but not least, Pryme Intercompany, our intercompany data exchange solution. Now an approval status and comment can be set on the external time entry. So now I would like to hand it over to Aske, and we will see each other at the end of the presentation for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So first up, we have the advanced projects where we have the new WIP calculations with the different percent complete models. And so on the project card, we now have some different ways to calculate this. If I show this project card, we will see on my project that in the section for WIP recognition, settings, allocations, on the fixed side, I can now select some new options. I can select to have percent complete calculation. And the new thing is I can define what that calculation is based on. It can either be based on cost, which is the currently selected. And in that case, it will take the total budgeted cost, look at the actual cost incurred so far, and calculate the percentage. And with this, on my current project, I get 18% because we incurred 18 of the budgeted costs. I could also look at quantity. There, look at the number of hours we have budgeted for and how much time we've actually used. And we can see by that metric, we've done 7%. So very different metrics, especially if there are big differences in cost for different resources. I could also go for a milestone, which is the third option. And here I get 15%. And this one we should dive into a little bit more. So for the milestone concept, I need to look at my milestones. And for this project, I've set up 3 different milestones. I have one for when the specification is done, one for when the development is done, and one for when the implementation is done. And we actually get a bit of an overview out here where we can see that we have defined that when the specification is done, by definition, our completion is 15%. So this is another way of setting completion. We've also said that when development is done, that accounts for 55% of the completion. So of course, this is additive and adds up. But currently we're at 15% because we have marked this milestone as being finished, meaning we then are 15% done. It's actually possible to set another completion percent than 100. So if you want to work with partially completed milestones, then you can do that. And you could say we are half done with the development milestone, and so put in 50% here. And so that gives you a new figure where we take 50% of the 55, and then of course that adds up and gives you a new figure. In general, I think it's easier for most cases to say either a milestone is done or it's not, but you can work with this partially completed milestone concept. So very powerful feature when it comes to revenue recognition and work in progress, that you can define how your completion is calculated. Is it based on cost? Is it based on quantity, or is it based on your milestones? Next up, we have the integration with Dynamics 365 Sales. And this one I will not demo today. I'll only mention it. And I recommend that you go check out the documentation. It's linked in the release notes that we've sent out. And it outlines the different ways this can be set up because there are multiple different scenarios. We might want to do a deep dive on this later on. But it requires a complete setup of different environments, which I unfortunately do not have access to at this point in order to show you. But the simple idea is that opportunities in Dynamics 365 Sales can generate the basis for a project in advanced projects. And this is something we've seen a lot of questions about and has been really a big ask. So we are very happy to be finally able to provide that. Next up, we have a new feature for Pryme Matters. It's a small feature, but an interesting feature. For Pryme Matters, we of course have a different way of creating invoices. We usually have invoice suggestions, but with Pryme Matters, we have invoice creation, which is a variation of the invoice suggestions. On the invoice suggestions, we've extended the concept of resource hours to also show both the hours to invoice, but also the amount to invoice. And this, of course, changes as you change the line, so you can always keep track of how many hours are we going to invoice per person, and also what is the amount per person, because at least for Pryme Matters, what you're invoicing per fee earner or per person is critical in some cases. For Pryme Time, we've added some two features. The first of them is on the calendar, where we've changed the logic a little bit around the indicators we have. So each of these projects have an indicator here, and we can see this one has a green indicator, means the time entry is up to date. So this time tracking entry is backed by a time entry, and that time entry is fully in sync with the time tracking entry. We also have some time tracking entries where we don't have time entries for them yet. They are marked with this empty circle. And maybe I don't want to create a time entry for my focus time. I need to figure out what I actually did during that period of time. So it makes sense that there's no time entry for it. But what happens if I make changes to a time tracking entry? I could open up this catch up with Connie. It's currently in sync. And I could realize that actually this was not a client meeting. This was supposed to be part of the implementation task. And so I changed that. And with that, we can now see that the status changes, and it says the time entry needs to be created or updated. And we can do that with the create and update time entries action. And then we're done with that. So, and that's probably because I got this one unchecked. So should be And so we are in sync again. So small little feature, make it easier to see what's up to date, what's not up to date. The big feature we're adding this time is a new report. This is the time entry patterns report, a time entry summary report that you will find under your resource reports, time entry summary. And this will generate an Excel sheet. We are switching from traditional reporting to Excel reporting, and this is one of the first reports we are doing. Microsoft is doing the same, as the Excel reports are quite powerful and give you a lot of opportunities to make your own changes to the reports without development. And so here I have a sample. I'll not use this demo environment. I have one prepared in another environment, which has a bit more interesting data. So this is what you get when you run the report. This is an Excel sheet, but it comes in two parts. First part is the data part, which is what is the analysis is based on. And then there's the actual report part. And that could, of course, be multiple sheets. In this case, it's just one sheet. What we're trying to show here is how time is tracked versus when it's tracked. So what we're showing here in the first section is an outline of a week where we can see that some days the time tracked that is not related to that day. Basically meaning people are not putting in the details of what they worked on the day they did the work. And we can very clearly see here that on Mondays, 78% of the time entries are for work performed on other days. Probably that's people putting in time on Mondays that were related to work they did last week. That might mean that they are losing a lot of details, they are forgetting things, and you might not be capturing all the time. On Thursdays and Fridays, we can see that this is fully green, meaning all the times entered on Thursdays and Fridays is related to work on Thursday and Friday. So this looks good. But we can also see that only 4 to 5% of the entries we have are on Thursdays and Fridays, which probably is quite low. We would expect to see about 20% of entries every day. And that again is because a lot of the time that is performed on Thursdays and Fridays is only entered into the system on the following Monday. And this is what we see here. So the name of the game here is to get a fully green screen. That would mean that everybody is tracking the time as they are doing the work. And that way, probably they are capturing all the details of their time. We can also see how we are tracking against the period. Here we see that 60% of the time is tracked after the end of the period, meaning for 1 week of time, 60% of the entries are entered in the following week or even later, which is, of course, again, an indicator that people are not tracking time on time. And we can look at how long we are overdue on average. So on average, people are tracking their days 1.7 days after they performed the work. And again, people are forgetting probably. So this is an indicator. You can use this report to see how people are tracking the time. You can use it for the entire company. You can slice it and dice it, look at different departments and see where you can get improvements to get better time tracking. If you're not already using Pryme Time, take this as an opportunity to install Pryme Time. It's free to try out. You can install it, run this report, get some data, see what it's like, and maybe you will get some better insights into how the people in your company are actually tracking their time. And maybe that also means that there are some improvements to be made. Lastly, we have for Pryme Intercompany a new feature for tracking changes or approval on external time entries. I will not show this directly, but just mention that if you're using the Pryme Intercompany feature to show time entries across different companies, that is the scenario where people in one company is working on a project for another company, when you get those time entries for approval in the company that will ultimately be paying for them, it's possible to put in comments, and these comments will go back to the approver in the company where the work is performed, and they can see those comments before making final approval. And with that, I think we can conclude the what's new part of the demo today. I'll shift gears a little bit and go into a deep dive of one of the features that I think has been going under the radar for a long time, and that is mileage and mileage processing when it comes to multiple rates and limits to that. In a lot of different countries, there is a need to track mileage, and there's a need to track different mileage rates for different kinds of mileage. One country that comes up is in the UK, and this is a scenario I will demo, but the same principle applies to a lot of other countries where there are either limitations on what kind of rates you can get depending on how far you've driven in a given year, or what kind of car you're driving, etc. And this is something we can set up with mileage types and mileage rates. So if I search for mileage, we can see I get mileage types and mileage rates. Mileage types I will start with, and I'm using a partial UK setup where I have rates for company cars, private electric cars, private petrol cars with very small engines, private cars with medium-sized, and private cars with the large-sized petrol engines. I haven't entered all the lines for bicycles and motorcycles and diesels, etc. I think this will suffice for the setup. Now, what's interesting here is that there are different rules that apply. Company cars have a special set of rules, and that is what we will find in mileage rates. We can see that the mileage rate here is split into two. There is one rate which has an upper limit of 10,000 miles, and for that we get 45 pence, and beyond that we get 25. So there's a limit of 10,000. That limit, of course, applies within one tax year, and after that it is reset, and the system will automatically keep track of that. So that's a company car scenario. We also have the private car scenario, and we can look at the rates. I'll take electric as an example, where there are different rates depending on the time. So we can see here that until September, the rate was 10, and actually I put it in completely wrong here because of course it should not be 10 pounds. It should be, I'm off a factor of 100, I see. I'll quickly correct that. So these are the rates that apply. And again, that is not correct. So 0.8. That makes a lot more sense. Otherwise, it would be a very good deal to buy a EV and drive that. But different rates at different times. So we control that by the date because that changes frequently over the years. And with these different rates, we can then enter mileage onto an expense sheet. I'll open up an expense sheet here. And on my expense sheet, I will put in some mileage. Of course, as usual, I'll put in my project number and I'll pull in the task. So this is for a client meeting, and I will pull in my payment type. This is something that I should be reimbursed for. And then I'll select mileage. So far, nothing new, but you'll see that there's now a mileage type column. This mileage type column shows up whenever there are mileage types defined. If you have not defined any mileage types, this column will not be visible. But here I can now select what kind of mileage it is. And I'll select company car. And I'll put in a mileage. Now I'll be a bit sneaky and say I started off with driving 10,000 miles, which means I get the higher rate. And then I'll put in a second line on the same expense sheet. Of course, it's very unlikely that you're putting in both of them on the same expense sheet. But just to show you, it works just as well as if it is previously recorded mileage. And here I'm driving additional 5,000 miles, and now we see I get the lower rate. So at that threshold, it switches to the lower rate when we get above 10,000. Of course, not necessarily within one expense sheet, it is within that tax year. But you can say, well, what if somebody doesn't drive different kinds of cars? Why should I always select what kind of mileage it is? I know that I'm always driving an EV privately because that's the car I have, or I'm always driving a company car. If that is the case, on the resource card, you can define a default mileage type. And so I will do this for Prakash, and I will say that actually his default is driving an EV privately. That means, I have a small update here on my system. That means that when he enters a expense sheet, that kind of mileage will be applied. So let's try again. Say EV, that is for Prakash. And opening up his expense sheet, we could create a new mileage line. Again, let's take the same project and same task and say this is mileage. And then automatically it says private EV because that is now his default. And of course, then he only needs to enter the number of miles he's driven. And then he gets a certain rate. So this is the mileage functionality. There's a lot of power in using that, setting that right up. If you have the need to have different rates at different levels or other needs, you can set up most scenarios for this need. And I think this concludes my deep dive into mileage and multiple rates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aske. Let's see whether someone has a question. You may use the chat. And yeah, it looks like there are no questions so far. So we will conclude it and hope to see each other for the next release. And I wish you a nice Thursday.